This is a production of Cornell University.
So it's a real pleasure to introduce Elisha Cohn, who is our speaker today. And Professor Cohn specializes in Victorian literature. She's the author of a fascinating study of states of trance and reverie called Still Life, Suspended Agency in the Victorian Novel. Is that still the title? Or?
I think so.
Okay. She has a special interest also in relations between science and literature, and that's an interest she shares with several other faculty in the English department. I think it's an excellent strategy for showing the value of the humanities by demonstrating that literary scholars can talk about science with real understanding and insight and show how literature itself draws on and at times criticizes scientific thought. Professor Cohn has been teaching a course on literature and medicine that's been getting rave reviews and teaching it again next fall, is that right?
Mm-hmm.
So if you haven't signed up for it, you'll have a chance to do that in the fall. She also teaches courses on Victorian fiction and poetry at all levels. And she will be talking with us today on the subject Lost, well, you can see it right there, Lost in a Book.
Thank you, Roger. Thank you all for coming out on this rather appalling spring day. And I would just echo again that injunction to go see the Shakespeare, because I think it's a really special experience to get to look at those books firsthand. So today I want to share with you some material from this book that I've recently just finished writing. And I thought in order to do that, I would start by giving a sort of more contemporary day-to-day kind of framework. And start by saying that I think how we talk about reading says a lot about how we think our minds and brains work. And it also says a lot about our perhaps tacit beliefs about how people ought to behave. There are often normative dimensions in how we talk about reading. So a question that tends to get asked a lot these days is, what's the role or point of reading fiction, of reading the novel in a digital world? This is, in some ways, a rather old-fashioned thing to do at this point, and perhaps some of you have been asked some version of this question when you made the decision to become English majors. What's the point of doing all of this reading? What's the life of the novel now in the age of the internet? So I'll say a little bit about two strategies that people tend to take these days for answering that question. One view is that distraction is rampant and it's dangerous, and that our ability to read novels is in great peril. That there's simply too much to read, that we're trying to read too many different things at once, often in too many different virtual windows. I've certainly had that experience of trying to read 17 things at the same time, each in its own little tab, and you start to feel crazy and like you can't focus. Has anyone else had this experience? Glad I'm not alone. I figured this is pretty common at this point. There was pretty recently a New York Times article called "The Loneliness of the Long-Distance Reader," sort of punning on the idea of the long-distance runner. So the idea there is that long-distance reading, like running, is a kind of mental exercise. It's discipline, it's exercise, it's good for you. And the writer of that article thinks that the ability to read novels has completely eroded, writing, "Today, with our powers of concentration atrophied by the staccato communication of internet, attention is easily diverted to addictive entertainment on our phones and tablets. Book-length reading is harder still." So there's this idea that our media is really threatening our ability to attend. Another contrasting view is that true distraction is actually undervalued by our culture. And I think the most prominent person to make this argument is a cultural critic named Jonathan Crary, whose work I really strongly recommend. he makes the point that we live in a culture of 24/7 productivity and acquisitiveness, that there is no longer any time in the day that we couldn't potentially be productive. There are no special days anymore where we can't check our email, do some work, that we live in this period of nonstop instrumentality, nonstop attempting to get things done, that doesn't leave any room for rest, true play, inattention. And we might think in this connection about a recent effort by some scientists to classify daydreaming as a clinical pathology in children. This is in the New York Times, reported just the other day. Some scientists have come up with the idea of what they're calling sluggish cognitive tempo. And it's sort of the opposite of ADD. And they're trying to think about the idea that overly daydreamy children might be eligible for certain kinds of clinical treatment. I find this a little concerning. That may be obvious. The implication of both of these views, the view that we don't have enough daydreaming, or the view that we are just overly distracted and our minds have decayed, is that there is an optimal pace for our attention, and that it's under threat by forms of media that we consume. In this connection, reading literature is sometimes credited with the power to help us achieve, actually, an ideal cognitive pace, and to attain the social benefits of the right level of attention. In other words, reading fiction is often credited with having a lot of very useful functions, while at the same time allowing us to feel absorbed, to feel like we're getting lost in a book. So in particular, there's a quite popular idea, and it has a long history, which I'll talk a little bit about in a moment, that reading absorbs us into a world not our own, but while doing so, engages our empathy, because it sensitizes us to the lives and experiences of others. So, for instance, the philosopher and critic Martha Nussbaum claims that the literary imagination promotes social justice. It helps us attune ourselves to the lives of other people who may be quite different from us, who live in entirely different worlds. Indeed, fiction is a non-world. It means people respond to them. Some of you might also know about a study published pretty recently in the journal Science, and this study claimed that reading fiction increased scores on tests of empathy and emotional intelligence. So they would expose their test subjects to a piece of literature, have them read it for about 10 minutes, and then they would test them on empathy, and they claimed that we could see a real rise in empathy. What kind of literature do we require? Does it work as well if you're reading a first-person narrative as a third-person narrative? What if the protagonist is an animal? There are lots of more technical questions that we could start to ask to put some pressure on these kinds of claims that literature promotes empathy. I would also note that the people who want to make these claims about the empathic power of reading literature tend to prefer as their best examples of literature 19th century and Victorian texts. And I'll say a good bit about this. So Martha Nussbaum really likes Dickens. And I know a couple of you in here right now have read with me the novel Hard Times. And that's her best example of a novel that can promote empathy. Whether you found that to be true when you read it yourself, you might reflect upon. The scientists being in the science focus on work on Anton Chekhov, and that study was actually popularized by headlines in blogs and things that said Chekhov will make you a better person. So one of the things I'm really interested in as we think about this is why the 19th century? Why is the 19th century credited with so much power to transform us? And also a much more general concern that these kinds of claims, yeah.
So you're saying 19th century, but was it the 19th century invoked the most empathy, or were other time periods tested as well?
Well, the journal in Science used a number of different kinds of stories. But it's interesting, they used some John Bart, I think, as well, so some 20th century work. But it's very interesting to me that when this was being popularized, when it was being pushed in science, but it was being sort of republished in other places, people really focused on Chekhov, the late 19th century writer. So they sort of framed it in this 19th century way, even though the study itself had used a pretty wide range of different stories. That's a great question. Some of the other issues with citation is that the claim that reading will make us better, that reading will make us more empathetic, sort of risks over-instrumentalizing literature, turning it a little bit too much into a tool, idealizing it by claiming that it can be measured, that our response is measurable, that it can be turned into data, and that it does work in the world. There's a certain anxiety about these kinds of claims. What if literature had no work? What if it didn't have a overtly productive function? There seems to be some anxiety. Nick Dames puts it, this poses a burden for novelists who becomes the savior for the cognitive well-being of culture. Novels are this theater fiction. So the rest of what I want to say to you today concerns the literary history of these kinds of debates. And I'll suggest that even if we understand literature having unique effects on the attention, if we think that something unique does happen to us when we get lost in a book, the idea of reading as improving us is neither self-evident nor historically consistent. And I'll show you some ways in which texts from the 19th century, which get called upon to do all this work for us, actually have a much more ambivalent attitude toward that productivity, toward the idea that attention makes us better. So why does the 19th century play such a big role in these arguments? What's going on in the 19th century itself? There are some 19th century versions of the same debates that we see now, both the idea that attention is being destroyed and the idea that reading improves it. So some critics during the 19th century, especially the 1860s, and I can say a little bit more later about why the 1860s was this moment of particular anxiety, were very concerned with how media would affect readers. And there were a lot of discussions about the damaging effects of novels, which sound quite a bit like how we talk about the destructive effects of reading on the internet. So for instance, Florence Nightingale, whose name you probably know because she was a famous nurse, complained about women who, as she puts it, live on opium or on novels all their lives. They're exhausted with feelings which lead to no action. So from her perspective, reading novels is like taking opium. It's a drug. It's dangerously useless, and it will lead you to neglect your wifely duties. So watch out. Similarly, the critic Alfred Austin wrote in 1874, reading, as it is presently conducted, is destroying all thinking and powers of thought. So again, beware. And I wanted to show you this painting, which is more or less contemporaneous. I don't know if you can see it too well, but there's the voluptuous, opiated reader. And if you can see in the sort of left-hand corner, there's the devil. Do you see him down there? So it's a little unclear whether he's pushing the novel toward her or pulling it away. But in any case, he seems to, his hand is in, right? He's involved in this scenario. And she is very much sort of absorbed or over-absorbed in this book. It seems hard to imagine that she's going to get up and start bustling around the house mere moments later. So there's great anxiety at this moment about what's happening to readers. But around the same time, many Victorian writers were making extremely strong claims for literary reading's benefits and taking up that cultural savior role full force. They were like, yes, we are going to save our culture. We are going to fix this situation. So there was an enormous emphasis in the 19th century on literature aiding the active cultivation of one's own mind. I think in this connection particularly of the novelist George Eliot, who memorably calls novels the raw material of moral sentiment. And from her perspective, and she articulates this in a number of places, but especially her novel Adam Bede and an essay on the natural history of German life. She has the idea that in encountering the richly rendered lives of fictional characters, that we learn better how to understand difference, how to understand otherness, and encounter it in a more nuanced, more complex way. So if we take Eliot seriously, we get the idea that, again, that reading improves us. And I would note in this connection that many recent readers of Eliot have absolutely taken up this idea. Pretty recently, there was a biography, an interesting biography, and a really, I think, wonderful one, written of Eliot by a woman named Rebecca Mead. And the biography is called My Life in Middlemarch. And what Mead does is she talks about reading Middlemarch over and over again throughout her life. She talks about reading it when she was applying to college, reading it when she was in the middle of a romantic crisis in her 20s, reading it when she was getting married in her 30s, reading it again as she becomes a parent. And she makes the claim, I think Middlemarch has disciplined my character. So she makes the claim that reading this novel has, by having her encounter these very deep quandaries that the characters experience, that reading the novel has made her better. So there's quite a lot of emphasis on these ideas of work, discipline, and will. Yet another critic writes around this time, reading requires more resolution, more pertinacity, and more expenditure of brain tissue, in fact, work. I don't think that the literary taste can be satisfactorily formed unless one is prepared to put one's back into the affair. So once again, work, will, discipline, attempting to make literature productive, make it instrumental, has disciplined my character. So she makes the claim that reading this novel has, by having her encounter these very deep quandaries that the characters experience, that reading the novel has made her better. So there's quite a lot of emphasis on these ideas of work, discipline, and will. Yet another critic writes around this time, reading requires more resolution, more pertinacity, and more expenditure of brain tissue, in fact, work. I don't think that the literary taste can be satisfactorily formed unless one is prepared to put one's back into the affair. So once again, work, will, discipline, attempting to make literature productive, make it instrumental, has disciplined my character. So she makes the claim that reading this novel has, by having her encounter these very deep quandaries that the characters experience, that reading the novel has made her better. So there's quite a lot of emphasis on these ideas of work, discipline, and will. Yet another critic writes around this time, reading requires... So there's a lot of concern during this time about, and in our own, about productivity and the moral benefits of reading, as well as about the nature of self-control. So I'll get into a little more detail now, and I'll give you some literary examples, and I hope some of these will be familiar to many of you. So we might think back to one of the, I would say, first literary theorists writing at the very beginning of the 19th century, Samuel Taylor Coleridge. And he argues that reading stories or myths requires, quote, the willing suspension of disbelief. What does he mean by this? That we have a sense of control as we plunge into this patently untrue world of the story. We know that what we read when we open a novel is not true. And he says that we have to suspend that awareness in order to get into it, in order to really enjoy it. But at the same time, we have to will that suspension. That suspension has to be under control. You don't want to turn into her. So we have this sense that an exercise of active voluntary will is needed to enter into reading, and that reading is connected to a faculty associated with moral strength and self-regulation. But I wonder, do novels really support this association between reading and self-regulation? On the one hand, we might think of something like the opening of Jane Eyre. Who's read Jane Eyre? Yeah, I figured many of you might have. In Jane Eyre, reading is pretty strongly associated with the cultivation of individual identity, with Jane's sense of identity against the world. She is herself, and we learn that when we see her reading. At the very beginning of that novel, I won't give anything away for those of you who haven't read it, we encounter Jane closeted away behind a red curtain, reading. And she's isolated herself there. She's taken a book from the bookshelf. She hasn't been given permission, and she's sort of huddled up there with it. And her reading is a mark of her difference from other people. And it demonstrates and helps her to cultivate her imaginative, private self, which ends up getting her through a situation that is very, very challenging much later in her adulthood. Her ability to imagine is crucial to her ultimate success. Then again, we might think that for every Jane Eyre portrayed actively reading and interpreting, Victorian novels are full of characters who are not reading, who are falling asleep and getting distracted over their books. And this is, and I think this is the really important part, this is as much a source of great pleasure as it is a problem, a source of anxiety. I thought it might be nice to look at this image, which sadly is a little blurry on that large scale. But we have these sort of twinned figures. One is one reading, and the other not reading. And the image, in some ways, invites us to compare, but establishes a non-hierarchical relationship between them. They're twinned, they're flat, they're almost identical there. So there doesn't necessarily seem to be anything superior about reading to not reading. We don't know which direction this train car is necessarily going. There doesn't seem to be much motion at all. In fact, the image in the window seems quite static. We might think also of a novel called The Mill on the Floss, which if you haven't read, I highly recommend, if you have any predilection for Victorian novels at all. There, the protagonist loves to read, but we often see her dreaming over her books, forgetting her books, dropping her books on the floor, and never finishing them. She starts reading a lot of books over the course of this novel, but she never gets around to finishing any of them. The two novels I've just mentioned, Jane Eyre and The Mill on the Floss, both have female protagonists, and I would point, and you may have noticed that most of the people in the paintings I've shared with you are women, and I would note that gender is pretty important when thinking about the literary history of distraction, because women were assumed to be much more passive than men, more sensitive, but also more distractible. So you got people like the doctor and physiologist Thomas Laycock saying, "The human female is sooner affected by all stimuli, whether corporeal or mental, than the male." And this played out in claims about reading, and lots of treatises about women's physical constitution and women's health included discussions of women's reading habits. So you get someone like another Dr. E.J. Tilt writing, "Novels and romances, speaking generally, should be spurned, as capable of calling forth emotions of the same morbid description which, when habitually indulged in, exert a disastrous influence on the nervous system, sufficient to explain the frequency of hysteria and nervous diseases which we find among the highest classes." Doctors often, this is my favorite anecdote of all time, doctors often at this time prescribed raw beef juice to girls who were thought to be reading too much. Reading too much weakened their system, and so they were prescribed iron-rich beef juice. I thought I would share this cartoon from Punch as well, which seems to be mocking the female reader's sense of heroism. She's termed Donna Quixote. And that position of strength, her open-legged stance, these seem to be objects of some derision. So women reading was thought to be a very questionable practice in a lot of medical and moral discourse at that time. But, and here's my real sort of contention and my real investment. quite a lot of art, visual as well as novels themselves, resist the medical and moral attitudes toward reading at this time. And they resist also the attempt to make reading instrumental. They resist efforts to quantify or regulate the attention. So we might think about sensation fiction, which was a genre really popular in the 1860s. And this includes the work of the writer Wilkie Collins in particular, who writes novels like The Woman in White and The Moonstone. In another of his novels, The Queen of Hearts, he has a female protagonist say, "I'm sick to death of novels with an earnest purpose. What I want is something that seizes hold of my interest and makes me forget when it's time to dress for dinner, something that keeps me reading in a breathless state to find out the end." So this is sort of pro-addictive reading, reading not for any purpose whatsoever, but reading just to keep reading to have that sort of sensation of being caught up. There are also quite a lot of images that are produced in this time, painting being one kind of the image, that is sort of aestheticize or portray in very beautiful visual language women not reading. So we get images like the one on the wall up there of a woman sort of absorbed in her book. But we also see a lot of images of women not reading, of women sort of sitting next to books. So she looks a little bored. This is a little harder to see. But Dante Gabriel Rossetti, in particular, creates a lot of images of women sort of in league with books, in the company of books, but not necessarily attentively reading them. And yet this doesn't seem to be problematic. I don't think we're meant to be too worried about the physical decline of these figures. They look pretty robust. So there is that sort of implication of she's received the apple of knowledge. And yet she doesn't have to be sort of focused on that. She's looking almost at us, but not quite, which is sort of interesting. We kind of get the impression that she's experienced something from her book privately, that she's had this experience of sort of looking into the book and learning. And she thus has a kind of inward mystique. We don't know quite what she's thinking. We don't know quite what she's experiencing. And yet she's also very beautiful. She's available to our gaze. She's almost looking at us. She's sort of almost soliciting our gaze. The woman reading the book or even not reading the book becomes rather like a book herself. She becomes something to be sort of read or interpreted. Rossetti writes a poem called Jenny, in which a male speaker is talking about and talking to a prostitute whom he's hired for the night, and she's sleeping, and he sort of soliloquizes over her, and he tells her, "You know not what a book you seem." So there's this interest in sort of thinking about women in relation to books, not to suggest that women are sort of failing in their relation to books, but that books can be a source of simply pleasure. So there is quite an obsession in the medical and moral discourse with readers' distraction and anxiety about wasted time and energy, wasted labor, unfulfilled potential. But in images like this, I think there's more ambivalence about the mentality that turns all experiences into work and action. There seems to be a kind of experiment with letting those moral urgent considerations relax a little bit, to let them lapse. And it allows literature, it allows art not to be the instrument of an immediate moral goal. And I'll make sort of one sort of final turn here, and then we can talk a little more freely. And I would be really curious to know what this makes you guys think about, or what questions you have. So the last thing I want to sort of talk about is that the writers and artists who are working at this time, who are starting to imagine an experience of pleasure that isn't morally culpable, an experience of inattention that we shouldn't be too worried about, they're writing during the rise of biology, thinking about and casting doubt on the idea of the will. So biologists during this time are really questioning whether we truly have the capacity for intentional behavior at all, as they're starting to discover how the nervous system works, how the reflexes work. In particular, they're realizing that much of what goes on in our bodies and in our minds is opaque to us, that we have no idea of so much of what is at the base of our behavior. There was quite a lot of interest in non-deliberate and reflexive thought. Physiologists during this time were really interested in what happens when you read. And actually, many of them understood reading as a process that you could engage in without knowing it, that you could be reading and not realize you're reading, that you did not have to be attentive in order to read. They sometimes claimed it was like a mental reflex, a sort of habit. A lot of them were especially fascinated by the idea of sleeping and reading at the same time, or the ease with which reading could sort of turn into sleeping. And maybe some of us have had this experience of thinking that you're reading and suddenly your face is down. I don't have any good 19th century illustrations of that. If anyone comes across any, please let me know. Other than that first image, I suppose. So I'll give you a couple of examples of these writers who are interested in the slippery slope from reading to sleeping. The physiologist Alexander Bain compared reading to having a cataleptic fit or falling into a dream. Those are both things he compares it to. He writes, self-consciousness is in abeyance, and if the engrossment attains an extreme pitch, there's an almost entire suspension of a feeling or emotion, pleasure and pain, even though arising out of the situation, it cannot be felt. And another thinker along these lines says, the mere cessation of an impression that was present at the time of falling asleep may cause the sleeper to awake. Thus, a person who sleeps while another is reading often starts when the reader pauses. So you can be, conking out while someone's reading, and the moment they stop reading, you'll wake up. So in order to think about sleep, in order to think about cataleptic fits, they always went to reading as their example of how this should work. It's a very strange phenomenon. And then finally, George Eliot's partner, G.H. Lewis, who was also a physiologist, writes, it may happen that we fall asleep during a sermon. Such cases, he admits, have occurred. Or while a book is being read aloud. The sound of the speaker's voice is heard, but the words gradually cease to be perceived. Page after page is read aloud, exciting no perception at all in our minds. But has there been no sensation excited? We have not heard, but have we not been affected by the sounds? To prove that we have is easy. Let the reader suddenly cease, and if our sleep be not too profound, we at once awake. Pretty much the exact same scenario as the writer I just cited. Now, unless the sound of his voice affected us, he concludes, it's clear that the sensation of that sound could not have affected us. So these physiologists are all really interested in the way reading and the experience of being read to shows us how little attention actually matters, how much of our mental life is profoundly inattentive. So here, reading takes hold of our bodies without any guiding force of the will. There's no willed suspension of disbelief in any of these scenarios at all. It doesn't really matter either what's read. What we get out of reading is apparently beside the point. None of these writers specifies what we're reading in these scenarios. And it goes totally unreported. So Lewis says a reader has been affected. That suggests a pretty passive, non-instrumental understanding of the reading experience, as opposed to the more active, reflective term hearing. So he distinguishes between hearing and affection. When we hear, we're listening, we're attending. But when we're affected, that's just sounds hitting our eardrums, really, in his account. And reading from all of these perspectives doesn't really seem to count as work. It doesn't really do anything to us, to the world. It doesn't motivate us to be different than we are. So to conclude, I wanted to share with you a scene from the writer Elizabeth Gaskell's novella Cousin Phyllis, which I was introduced to by a speaker who came here to visit a couple of months ago. And this passage, I think, really quite beautifully illustrates that a moral purpose is only one dimension of reading for Victorian writers. And Gaskell was actually sort of a family friend of Alexander Bain, one of the physiologists I just mentioned, so it seems pretty clear that she was deliberately engaging with all of these physiologists' interests in sort of reading without reading, of reading without paying attention. So I'll show you the passage up here. So in this passage, the main character, Paul, is talking about an experience of reading that stresses its status as a kind of physiological activity, a habitual activity. So Gaskell writes, "Cousin Holman gave me the weekly county newspaper to read aloud to her, while she mended stockings out of a high piled-up basket, Phyllis helping her mother. I read and read, unregardful of the words I was uttering, thinking of all manner of other things, of the bright color of Phyllis's hair, as the afternoon sun fell on her bending head, of the silence of the house, which enabled me to hear the double tick of the old clock which stood halfway up the stairs, of the variety of inarticulate noises which Cousin Holman made while I read to show her sympathy, wonder, or horror at the newspaper intelligence. The tranquil monotony of that hour made me feel as if I had lived forever, and should live forever droning out paragraphs in that warm, sunny room with my two quiet hearers, and the curled-up pussycat sleeping on the hearth-rug, and the clock on the house stairs perpetually clicking out the past moments. By and by, Betty the servant came to the door into the kitchen and made a sign to Phyllis, who put her half-mended stocking down and went away to the kitchen without a word. Looking at Cousin Holman for a minute or two afterwards, I saw that she had dropped her chin upon her breast and had fallen fast asleep." So what really interests me about this passage is that there are two different kinds of sleepy reading happening here. On the one hand, you get Cousin Holman, who is at first trying to pay attention and to listen sympathetically. She's making all these little clucks and noises that show that she's paying attention to the intelligence of the county. But then she eventually falls asleep, just as all these physiologists imagined she might do. Paul doesn't exactly fall asleep. His attention sort of wanders and spreads out everywhere. His mind sort of makes contact with everything in the room. This passage is very visual and very almost tactile too. We can imagine the texture of a lot of these things. His consciousness is kind of diffused and affected and affecting almost everything around him in the room. His experience seems to be very sensory, and it's not really directed toward anything else. This moment doesn't have any great impact on any of the rest of the plot that comes after. It's a moment where sort of nothing but pleasure happens, in a certain sense. There's a kind of suspension of the plot where tranquil monotony seems to last forever. And so if we think about passages like this one, and there are many, I just happen to really love this one, especially because it shares those sensations with us, with the reader. We get a sort of community of sensation that builds up in the passage. We get to experience those sort of subtle pleasures that Paul himself is experiencing. These kinds of scenes of getting lost in a book acknowledge the many kinds of pleasures that are never turned instrumental, that don't quite seem to count as knowledge, that never really lead to growth. They don't do anything necessarily. They don't have that much of a purpose or an impact. But at the same time, they seem distinctly literary, and as the critic Garrett Stewart puts it, they make our involvement as readers more sensual, more fragile, and also more keen, perhaps a little more discontinuous. We're not sort of being didactically told what to do in this moment, and yet at the same time, it's very arresting. It sort of stops us in our tracks and lets us dwell in that pleasurable moment. So if the Victorian novel and Victorian novelists understood themselves to affect their readers, if they really seemed to put forward the idea quite strongly that literature is going to do something to you, the range of these effects is much wider than the debates about is reading good for you or bad for you would seem to imply. those effects are often much more fleeting or precarious and unacknowledged than we might have known from the beginning. So we'll stop there. Yeah.
Yeah, I guess I was just wondering again about the studies you referenced and how subjects were chosen. I mean, were they people who liked to read in the first place?
You know, I don't know the answer to that question. I would have to look back at it, but my suspicion is that they were not necessarily chosen for their particular predilection for reading, and they apparently tried to choose works that were not familiar to the reader. So they're not sort of super canonical works that everybody read in high school. They're not works that would necessarily be familiar. But I do think that's a really interesting question for assessing the validity of those studies. What were you thinking as you were asking the question? Does that seem?
Well, yeah, because if you actually gain pleasure from reading, I think you do tend to be absorbed and you do tend to empathize with characters. So it may not be the reading that's actually driving the increased empathy, but it may be something about you.
So it may be a very individualized experience, and one's own personal history with reading might affect that.
Am I right in thinking that they also gave people other kinds of reading material? I think there was, quote, literary fiction, and then maybe it was in popular fiction of some kind, genre fiction and nonfiction, and for each there was a slightly different result?
Yeah, so they used sort of nonfiction as well, but the nonfiction examples, I believe, had to meet the requirement of not being about a human subject, which doesn't seem like a necessary definition of nonfiction. So that puts a big constraint on the distinction already. It seems as if the goal here was to demonstrate that literary fiction has this particular effect, and the experiments were set up to maximize the possibility of finding that result. Since I kind of think a lot of the time when you read sort of especially longer journalistic accounts of human experiences, it can be rather a fun sort of mental experiment to imagine, well, what if this was fiction? What would the difference be? What would need to change if this were a story? Eric, did you?
Yeah, well, just a couple of things. The connection with sleep, I think, is, we know that people read to go to sleep, right? So, I mean, one of the ways you put yourself to sleep before you go to sleep is you pick up a book and you read it, and then it tires you out. TV can do that for you as well, but it's sort of classic with books. The other thing, I wondered about a couple of things. Freud, of course, was operating at the end of the 19th century, so you have the unconscious not only as a physiological phenomenon, but as a psychological phenomenon. And then I wonder what it means if, we have the pleasure of the text here in the ways described in this. What does it mean then to teach books in schools where, in fact, you're instrumentalizing the activity completely because it's tied to a grade, it's tied to certain kinds of activities that actually are compelled rather than sort of free form. So I wondered about that tension as well, because we're in a period of time here in the 19th century when the discipline of literature has not been formed the way it will be formed in the 20th century and instituted into curricula in particular kinds of ways. You're still operating with a classical curriculum here in ways, the trivium and the quadrivium, where imaginative literature is not part of the exercise. So that may have something to do with the sort of speculation that's going on at that particular moment. I wonder how it changes once there is a literary studies curriculum.
So that makes me think of a couple of things. One being that, yes, this idea that we sort of should read literature in order to become educated people, and in order to have a sort of more refined emotional vocabulary and all of these things that are bound up with the creation of English curricula. that idea is probably not going anywhere because it's been central to the formation of our discipline. It was very important to Matthew Arnold, who is one of the first writers to really talk about creating an English curriculum. This idea that it builds a kind of not only an individual ethos, but actually a sort of national consciousness, that we all read the same things and we're kind of pulled together into this community who've all had this shared experience. So I think that idea is not going anywhere, but at the same time, we can take a little bit of critical distance from it and not imagine that this is something that we should necessarily hold up as the only way of understanding what literature does. I'm not in any way really advocating that we abolish that idea either, but just that we hold it in a kind of maybe more dialectical or conversational relationship, that we sort of reflect critically on it. The other thing I would say is that the critic Catherine Robeson has written pretty recently a book called Heartbeats, which is about the history of memorization and the sort of rise and fall of poetry memorization in school curriculum. Did any of you have to memorize poems in school? Some of you are shaking your head no. Some of you are nodding yes. It used to be in America, in Canada, in England, an extremely important part of sort of literary learning. And Robeson's point is that the emphasis was very much not, in fact, on interpretation in a lot of these recitation practices. Rather, the point was to sort of encode into your body the poem, to sort of have it as part of your lived experience, to have that sort of rhythmic shared experience with the other people there in your class. And while there were contests that allowed students to compete and awarded prizes for who had given the best recitation, it was interestingly not very interpretive. So the idea was that the poem would be this kind of physical experience, both pleasurable and disciplinary. It would sort of help you regulate your body, but it was also a way of experiencing a kind of bodily pleasure. Of course, this is to some extent fallen by the wayside as more interpretive models of reading have become more prominent as the 20th century went on.
So, Professor, when you were exploring this idea of utility behind reading and enjoying literature, I was reminded of Edward Snowden's case, because apparently when he was stuck at the international airport in Moscow, his father had sent him a book by Dostoevsky, Crime and Punishment, and he had said, I was profoundly affected and comforted by the moral dilemma. And going back to that same time window of 19th century, it really makes you wonder, so does good literature really have this morally uplifting and cleansing value, but then you look at all these politicians who supposedly read all this great Western canon and end up doing the same corrupt whatever that has happened over the history. So I didn't really have a position on that. So how do we just, yeah.
Well, the thing that I feel like saying about that is, we want our politicians to be readers, right? There's always a lot of interest in what's President Obama's favorite book, what's President Bush's favorite book. This seems to be a subject of a lot of attention and energy and scrutiny. We seem to want them to have this kind of engagement with literature, and yet it doesn't really always pan out in quite the way we would expect. Actually, the author Teju Cole, who was just here giving a reading a couple of weeks ago, has written a little bit about President Obama's reading list and has claimed, well, we finally have a president who's a reader. We would expect him to have a certain kind of politics because he loves all of these very morally nuanced, complicated 19th century books. And yet, in Teju Cole's view, the president doesn't sort of live up to the nuance of the novels themselves. So I would
say, tell that to the people at Guantanamo about moral nuance.
What I'm curious about is kind of set up this idea that we're facing these similar challenges and distraction in our reading now, less reading itself as a practice, as opposed to the medium and materiality in which we read, because certainly as this increase in explosion, if you will, and novels themselves were serialized, and so you would have thick novels, but at the same time you could also read them kind of incrementally as they were published, and even in this example, it's a county newspaper and not a great novel. And then another Will P. Collins example I'm struck when he tries to, he's walking through London trying to find the character of periodicals, and he ends up just kind of randomly taking certain periodicals, realizing that he can never read the vast corpus of stuff that's out there. And so, yeah, that's my question, is how much of it is maybe this process of reading versus the form and material that we're actually engaging with.
Well, I think the anxiety about what reading means is a direct response to changes in forms of media. And I think that's the case now, and I definitely think it was the case in the 19th century. As you said, there was an immense rise in literacy in England over the course of the 19th century, and literacy was very, very high in England, really by the 1840s, well before primary education was mandated in 1870. Already around 1820, literacy rates were about 95%. And you're right, again, there was this explosion of forms of print media, particularly enabled by changes in how paper was made. When paper was no longer being made using rags and started to be made using tree pulp, it became much, much cheaper and much easier to print. And so there's this profusion of newspapers and journals and magazines and circulars and lots of things that could be read. And publications marketed for all different kinds of audiences. For example, there was the so-called penny dreadful, which cost a penny and tended to involve tales of murder. And there are actually some cartoons in the journal Punch that show ladies borrowing penny dreadfuls from their maids. So there's this way in which there's a kind of cross-class movement of all of this writing. So, I think absolutely that anxiety is in part in response to that proliferation. At the same time, I think there's a very overt rivalry between different forms of text. And actually this is one example where the thing that the novel does is a little different from the thing that the newspaper does. Lots of novels thematize not only novel reading, but newspaper reading in particular. And many writers at this time are really interested in trying to make a claim for novels doing something distinct from the newspaper.
We sort of, I'm sorry, go ahead.
I was wondering if you could talk a little bit more about why the 1860s was the time when all of these questions about reading and like ethical reading versus just reading for pleasure, why was it the 1860s when all of these questions came up?
Well, I think the primary reason for that is that many of these sort of physiological texts were coming out in the late 1850s. And many of the writers who were most interested in and concerned about the sort of biological sciences were actively reading that material, which was coming out in the 1850s, late 1850s. So then that makes its way into their work in the 1860s, and particularly into sensation fiction, which is this genre that, the critic D.A. Miller puts it, explicitly addresses itself to the nervous system. It's this kind of experience of reading that's going to emphasize just you're getting caught up in it. And those works tend to really thematize sort of weird physiological experiences. There's a lot of fainting, a lot of trances, a lot of suspended animation, a lot of opium use. There's a lot of physiological emphasis in those texts, which I think was all the more source of anxiety for critics who thought this was a bad idea to expose the susceptible woman reader in particular.
Yeah, I'm thinking of mesmerism, which is a big thing in Hawthorne, actually.
Yeah.
Among other physiological responses.
Which is interesting because mesmerism is very popular in England in the 1830s and 1840s, and then kind of goes underground for a while. But then hypnotism begins to be developed late 1850s. So that becomes a source of interest again, right at that exact same period.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. It's nice to see so many unfamiliar faces as well as familiar ones. I hope I'll get the chance to talk to more of you.
This has been a production of Cornell University, on the web at cornell.edu.